Imagine a place where the oath to do no harm is twisted into a command to cause unimaginable pain. A place where science isn't a search for truth, but an excuse for pure barbarism. In the heart of Japanese-occupied China, this place was real.
Unit 731 compound is one of the most terrifying secrets in the 20th century. From 1939 to 1945, at least 3,000 people were killed here.
It was a massive, top-secret compound where doctors became torturers and scientists became monsters. And thousands of living, breathing human beings. They were treated as nothing more than raw material for some of the most horrific experiments ever imagined. This wasn't some rogue operation. It was a state-sponsored program of methodical, calculated cruelty. This is the story of Unit 731. A place where science was completely divorced from morality and became something truly evil. Officially, it was called the Epidemic Prevention and Water Purification Department of the Kwantung Army, a harmless, even helpful-sounding name made to hide a terrifying reality. People in the occupied territory of Manchuria were told the heavily guarded facility was just a lumber mill. Inside, the staff embraced the lie with a sick joke. The human prisoners, dragged in by the feared military police, weren't called prisoners or patients, they were called maruta, the Japanese word for logs. A former technician remembered his colleagues asking each other, "How many logs did you down today?" Not a single one of the logs survived. Every man, woman and child who walked through the gates of Unit 731 was destined for a brutal death, their suffering carefully recorded in the name of imperial ambition. At the center of this web of horror was one man, Surgeon General Shiro Ishii. Born into a wealthy land-owning family, Ishii was brilliant, charismatic, and fueled by a fanatical nationalism. He graduated from Kyoto Imperial University's medical school and shot up the ranks of the army. But he wasn't interested in being a regular military doctor. He was a visionary. But his vision was indeed dark. After touring research facilities in Europe and America, Ishii was convinced that the future of war wasn't in bombs and bullets, but in tiny, invisible killers. He looked at the 1925 Geneva Protocol, which banned germ warfare not as a moral red line, but as proof of its incredible power. If the world's strongest nations were afraid of these weapons, he argued, then Japan had to master them. With a persuasive, almost magnetic personality, he got the backing of the highest levels of the Japanese military and government, promising them a weapon that could win the war. But his research needed two things he couldn't find in Japan: total secrecy and an endless supply of human test subjects. The newly occupied territory of Manchuria, teeming with captured Chinese soldiers, political prisoners, and ordinary civilians, offered both. It was the perfect, lawless laboratory for his monstrous plans. In 1936, with the authority of Emperor Hirohito, Unit 731 was officially created, and Ishii was given absolute control. In the Pingfang district near the city of Harbin, a secret city of death was built. The Unit 731 compound was huge, covering over 6 square kilometers with more than 150 buildings. It had research labs, prisons, autopsy rooms, and crematoria, a self-contained ecosystem of horror. It was staffed by over 3,000 of Japan's best medical scientists and technicians, all promised promotions in exchange for their conscience. The whole place was designed for maximum efficiency in its cruel work. The prisons, which held hundreds of victims at a time, were right in the middle, surrounded by labs. This made it easy for researchers to pick and monitor their subjects. These victims were Chinese, Russian, Korean, and Mongolian. Men, women, and children rounded up by the military police. To the researchers, they weren't human. Thinking of them as people was discouraged. They were just logs to be used and thrown away. Their health was watched closely, not out of kindness, but to make sure they were high-quality materials for the experiments. They were fed well, but only so the data from their eventual torture and dissection would be pure. Every single person brought to Unit 731 was experimented on until they died. If anyone somehow survived an experiment, they were killed anyway. No one was ever supposed to leave to tell the tale. The daily routine inside Unit 731 was a non-stop cycle of torment, all recorded with cold, scientific precision. The atrocities were so varied and systematic, they could fill a textbook of horror. One of the most common things they did was vivisection. Prisoners, often after being intentionally infected with diseases like the plague or cholera, were cut open alive without any anesthesia. The researchers believed anesthesia would mess up the results, so they'd strap conscious men, women, and even pregnant women to operating tables. They would remove organs one by one, studying how a disease destroyed a living body. A former medical assistant never forgot the unimaginable screams of a man he was ordered to dissect, sounds that haunted him for the rest of his life. Frostbite experiments were another specialty. A physiologist named Yoshimura Hisato was especially interested in hypothermia. Prisoners had their arms and legs submerged in ice water until they were frozen solid. One witness said that when a frozen arm was hit with a cane, it sounded like a wooden plank. The scientists would then try out different ways to thaw the blackened limbs, dumping scalding water over them, holding them over a fire, or just letting them rot with gangrene. Through this unbelievable cruelty, they scientifically figured out the best way to treat frostbite. Submerge it in water between 100 and 122 degrees Fahrenheit, a piece of medical knowledge born from pure torture. But the unit's main goal was to create biological weapons. They grew huge amounts of deadly pathogens: anthrax, cholera, typhoid, and dysentery. They bred millions of fleas infested with the plague and packed them into special ceramic bombs. These weapons were tested on prisoners tied to stakes in open fields, while planes dropped the bombs to see how wide their deadly range was. They also unleashed these plagues on unsuspecting Chinese cities, poisoning wells and dropping infected fleas, causing epidemics that killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. The list of horrors feels endless. They tested flamethrowers and grenades on live targets. They locked people in high-pressure chambers until their eyes exploded. They spun people in huge centrifuges until they ultimately died. They cut off limbs to study blood loss, sometimes trying to reattach them to the opposite side of the body. They forced women to become pregnant, infected them with diseases like syphilis, and then dissected them and their unborn babies to see the effects. There was no line they wouldn't cross, no act too depraved in their hunt for data. In August 1945, as the Soviet Union invaded Manchuria and the war was ending, Ishii knew the game was up. He gave his last order: destroy everything. The main buildings were blown up with dynamite, evidence was buried, and all the remaining prisoners were killed to make sure they stayed silent. Ishii faked his own funeral and went into hiding, but American intelligence eventually found him. But there would be no trial for him, or his top scientists. In one of history's most cynical deals, the United States, desperate for an edge over the Soviet Union in the new Cold War, cut a deal. General Douglas MacArthur granted full immunity from war crimes prosecution to Ishii and his staff. In exchange, they had to hand over all of their research data. The US wanted Japan's biological warfare secrets and was determined to keep them away from the Soviets. Justice for the hundreds of thousands who died was traded for a strategic advantage. The architects of all this suffering walked free. Shiro Ishii died of throat cancer in 1959, never spending a single day in court for his crimes. Many of his subordinates went on to have incredible careers in post-war Japan, becoming deans of medical schools, heads of pharmaceutical companies, and top officials in the health ministry. For decades, helped by the American cover-up, the Japanese government denied Unit 731 even existed. Textbooks were censored, and the story was buried. The story of Unit 731 is a terrifying reminder of what happens when science loses its humanity, when nationalism is used to justify any atrocity, and when politics protects criminals from justice. It shows how normal, educated people, doctors and scientists who took an oath to heal can be convinced to commit the most extraordinary acts of evil. The victims were erased, first by being called logs, then by fire and dynamite, and finally by decades of official silence and denial. It wasn't until the 1980s that the truth started to leak out, and only in 2002 did a Japanese court finally admit the country had used biological warfare. The slow release of official documents and member lists continues to shed light on this dark chapter. The story of Unit 731 isn't just a grim history lesson, it's a warning. It forces us to ask awful questions about the nature of evil and how easily we can forget our own humanity. To forget what happened at Pingfang is to risk it happening again. We have to remember the victims, not as logs, but as thousands of real people who suffered in a factory of death, whose killers were never punished. If you think this look into one of history's darkest secrets is important, please consider subscribing and sharing this video. Spreading this knowledge is the only way to make sure these victims aren't forgotten, and that their story serves as a vital lesson for us all. Click the notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the stories that history tried to bury. If you like the video, go ahead and like it. I've been Josh. This is The Villainous Vault. Thanks for watching.